In the Deku Tree analysis, I said the most impactful aspect of the first dungeon was how well it set up the challenges found later in the game, and the atmosphere of the lonely, secluded forest. Dodongo's Cavern continues these trends well enough, but it doesn't have the same long-lasting punch that the Deku Tree had, which is funny considering how smoothly Dodongo's Cavern progresses in difficulty and how imaginative the theme of the dungeon is. I think Dodongo's Cavern is a case of a great idea just not fully realized in its execution. The basis for my analysis will be gameplay and level design, enemies and challenging puzzles, and most importantly, the aesthetic and theme. I first want to address the pre-dungeon material. The portion before the dungeon is the longest stretch of loosely guided non-dungeon gameplay in the entire child section of the game. The stretch leading into the second dungeon is built up considerably more than the first. This time around there's more emphasis on the danger of the cavern and the consequences of failure. The Gorons are in a dire situation, as they are at risk of starvation due to their food source being cut off. The Gorons also have far more personality than the Kokiri children, which were essentially nothing more than instructions with NPCs overlapped on them. All of this gives Dodongo's Cavern more weight behind it than simply completing the next level. While this has little to do with the dungeon itself, it's a nice addition that helps bring the player into the world just a little more. It's kind of odd, because I think it's an effective formula, but it's actually pretty underused in this game. A lot of the adult dungeons are isolated from the rest of the world, and the curse upon them remains locked behind doors and crumbling walls. I think the developers realized the potential they had missed out in this game, which is why every dungeon in Majora's Mask correlates directly to a problem with the people that live near it. I just think that having the world and NPCs struggle be directly tied to beating a dungeon is a good way to bridge the gap between the player and the world. Anyway, upon entering the dungeon, Link will be forced to destroy his first destructible barrier. It's an entirely safe place to learn the concept, and it is pretty effective for building anticipation for exploring the second level. However, I have to admit, destroying the rock barriers is completely mindless, and really only serves to make the player come up with a different way to open a door. Dodongo's Cavern boasts an imposingly large central room. This room is the largest out of the child dungeons, but as with the Deku Tree, it's really more of an illusion than actually being something confusing. There's only two possible paths to choose, and because the left side is blocked, the only available way to go is the right. Several rooms are locked behind destructible walls, but they really offer nothing more than extra item refills. If the player finds the correct course, they will run into their first Dodongo. These are nothing but babies. Eventually Link will run into the adult Dodongos, and at the end Link will fight the King Dodongo. The progression in the size of the enemies is pretty cool, and it's something I didn't notice until getting footage for this video. That's not to say they become more difficult, however. I find the babies are actually the most annoying of the bunch. Unlike the others, they spring out of the ground out of nowhere, and they can leap forward, which strangely makes them unpredictable. They also don't give you anything in return for beating them, so losing lives to them is pretty punishing. Anyway, there's an optional room hidden behind some rocks that Link can access if he backtracks to this room once he gets to the bomb bag. But he can also get it right away if he causes a baby Dodongo to explode right next to it. This is another one of those puzzles that I really like in this game. Just as with burning the spider webs in the Deku Tree, using the very limited resources at your disposal in a creative fashion to solve a puzzle is very rewarding. Unfortunately, the game doesn't really reward the player all that well. Honestly, the golden skull pillars are kinda lame, and really don't give off any real satisfaction for finding them. It's clear to me that the developers realized this and so improved it in Majora's Mask by giving the Skulltulas their own levels and incorporating the lost fairies into the dungeons instead. Finding all of the fairies increases significantly in challenge, as well as the rewards for doing so. The blue switch is different than the normal one because it doesn't stay pressed once Link steps off of it. The solution is obvious, it's just a matter of pushing something heavy onto it. The statues here are lifeless, but make for a pretty neat enemy later on. But as for the block pushing puzzles, I have to admit I'm not really the biggest fan. They really don't take a lot of thinking to solve, and they mostly serve to slow the player down. Most of the time they just block Link from getting through a door. They're best used when they are involved in multi-room or even multi-story puzzles, but when they're just confined to a single room, they tend to come across as pretty lame. Once the player has done that, they enter an area that I consider to be the most memorable from the entire dungeon. The hexagonal platform sticking out of the lava surrounded by giant lava waterfalls is super cool imagery. It's only made better given the fact that this is the bottom floor of a multi-level room, and the player will later be able to reach what lies at the top of the lava fall. I wish the whole cavern was like this, but more on that later. The lizard enemies are really fun to fight, as they are the first enemy to really engage the player in combat. They hop above and around Link, take turns fighting, and require better timing to hit and avoid them than the previous enemies, which were mainly stationary. Defeating them is still pretty easy, but I admit they're still fun to fight. The corridor leading out of the lava room is also pretty memorable, but not in the same striking manner as the previous areas. In contrast to the striking bold reds and hot lava and smoke, this area is cold and still. The hue is a cold blue and it works so well for leaving the experience in your mind after playing. I don't understand why the entire dungeon couldn't have looked like this, but again, more on that later. The puzzle in this area is really easy and can barely be described as a challenge. Just light the 3 torches and the door opens. I'd say out of this entire dungeon, the previous room and this one are by far the most memorable, even though there's better challenges later on. In the aesthetics portion of this review, I will explain why that is, but as you probably already know, it has to do with color. So, essentially that whole area was an extended trip to unlock the door on the other side of the central hub. Better make sure you don't miss that switch on your way down. So, the newly opened path leads to a room with a pillar surrounded by bomb flowers. The problem doesn't take a whole lot of genius to solve, but at least it makes for some cool imagery. There's also a room directly across from the pillar that contains the compass and what I believe is the first encounter with the enemy statues. As an enemy, they're pretty fantastic. Because the game has already taught you to go up to them and grab them, the shock that this one is alive and angry is pretty effective. And just like every other enemy in this dungeon, they explode once they die. What I really like about them though is that from now on, the game is going to make you paranoid about every statue you encounter from this point onward. The compass itself is pretty lame, but I think a part of that I haven't discussed already is just why are the compass and map separate items? Navigating the more complicated rooms off the map alone is impossible, and using the map and compass isn't really necessary most of the time. And if you play like me, it's never necessary? So yeah, I'd say just combine the compass and the map into a single item and introduce it early in every dungeon. It's a little odd that the games before and after this one used this exact formula when it doesn't really hold any merit. So after ascending the newly created staircase, Link will enter a circular room with a locked door adjacent to the entrance. This room is really nothing special. Kill the enemies in the way, and press the switch to progress. As I've already said, I don't really like these puzzles all that much because I feel they don't really make the player think about what they're doing. Whatever though, it's not really that big of a deal. This room feeds back into the central hub and now we are on the second floor. I like this perspective and once again, I like the fact that this game takes advantage of the 3D space. Exploring an old area from an elevated perspective is a trope in this game, but it's always so cool so there's really no issue. If the player hasn't somehow figured it out yet, yes, Link is inside the skeleton of a giant long-lost titan. So that's neat. Avoiding razor scooters isn't all that concerning, as there's plenty of health to go around, but I do like the use of the camera in a claustrophobic space. It's the first time the game restricts the line of sight to such a degree, so at least it's a new challenge in the midst of a bunch of already established ones. More importantly, however, is the next problem ahead of Link. The player has to blow up the wall in front of the path ahead, but this time there's no substantial area to place the bomb in front of it. Link can't walk over there with the bomb, so it has to be thrown. What the player will have to do next is either time the throw just right so that the bomb explodes in midair while at the level of the barrier, or throw the bomb from just the right distance so that it lands on the sliver of ground in front of it. I really like this challenge because it's the only real evolved variation of the previously established mechanic of blowing walls up. Earlier, all you had to do was place a bomb next to the door. Now this puzzle demands a level of skill or luck to complete. I wish more of the puzzles earlier in the dungeon had been like this, as it would have been a good improvement overall. Next area is my favorite from the whole dungeon. It's the upper level of the lava fall area, and it's super cool to see the previous area from high up. It's these kinds of rooms that give Zelda a real sense of space, and do a lot for convincing the player that they are in a real cave. The same lizards from earlier come back to exact their revenge, but they still suck, so it's gonna be a no for them. After repeating the exact same eye puzzle, the player will finally get the bomb bag. Basically, all this means is the game doesn't have to give you a bomb flower every time a puzzle requires the use of explosives. I kinda forgot that this was this dungeon's item. It just feels so inconsequential, given the fact that you've been using bombs the whole time, and there hasn't been a single instance where there have been destructible barriers that you couldn't get through because there weren't bomb flowers immediately available. So yeah, I'm not saying bombs aren't a cool weapon, they definitely are, it's just they don't come across as much of an upgrade. I really like the next portion of dropping bombs into the skull's eyes to open its mouth. It's a memorable moment and it's the kind of puzzle I really like. There's a plaque that nearly straight up tells the player how to solve it, but I still think it's effective anyway. It's hard for me to picture what playing this game would have been like for the first time, but I imagine that this step wasn't very obvious for a lot of people. This is also one of the first places where Link isn't walking on flat ground. I'm guessing that there aren't many of these areas because making dynamic objects, especially something that the player can interact with such as a floor, is a lot harder than just making everything flat and adding textures to it. Not a huge deal, just like to point out that this game is pretty flat, all things considered. The last stretch of the level is pretty uninteresting as a whole. Essentially, Link has to go down the only available path to push a block off a ledge so it can keep a blue button pressed. There's nothing visually interesting going on in this area. It's pretty much a long hallway to a big room that you can just run through. Seriously, there isn't a single thing that stops you during this entire process. It's basically a miniature repeat of the first section of the dungeon, except this time it lacks any depth. Whatever though, it's over quickly and now we get to fight the final boss. After blowing a hole in the floor, Link falls downward into the pit of fire. He realizes with utter horror that he is now trapped with the largest Dodongo he has ever seen. Fortunately, Link recalled that this was only the second dungeon of the game, and this was 3D Zelda, so it probably wouldn't be all that hard to win. And he was right, this boss is pretty underwhelming. I like its presence and I like the boss music, but other than that, yeah, it's pretty lame. It's easy, doesn't develop at all over the course of the fight, and takes 4 rounds of the same trick to beat, which isn't all that hard to figure out in the first place. My favorite bosses are the ones that go through stages, change attack patterns as the fight goes on, and get visibly more damaged and ferocious as the fight nears its end. None of that is present here. Dodongo is never going to be featured on a top 10 bosses list ever. He isn't even all that imposing, given the fact that you've been crawling around inside the skeleton of a Dodongo the size of a mountain, but oh well, at least I like the way he dies. Now finally for the portion I've really wanted to be discussing this entire time. The idea behind this cavern is super cool. Crawling around inside a cave created by the fossilized remains of a massive monster is so awesome. There's lava everywhere and dilapidated remains of some sort of structure. I love the history here. The giant skeleton holding up the walls of rock means that this creature died and had the earth encompass it and solidified around it before it decomposed. Maybe by a volcanic eruption or something? Just the thought that this thing once existed in Hyrule is such a cool idea. It hints to an earlier, more primitive and terrifying age when beasts could grow to such monstrous proportions. Or it could just be a statue. I feel kinda dumb adding this, but there's actually a painting of this Dodongo in Goron Village I had never noticed before until now. I never could make it out, so I always just ignored it. There's clearly a rivalry between the Gorons and the Dodongos, and legends of these massive titans are depicted in these paintings. I like the fact that the game alludes to this deeper history without ever actually explicitly mentioning it. Unfortunately, this doesn't translate into the final product all that well. The biggest issues are that this level is extremely flat, which doesn't help it feel organic. It's kind of boring puzzles and the unbearably dull color palette. There was a reason I said the lava room and the room after it were the most memorable from this dungeon. That is because they had some sort of color to portray their atmosphere. For the majority of the time, this dungeon is a neutral brown and gray. It's unimaginative, dull, and it completely misses out on what being deep in the volcanic earth should be like. The lava fall is the only area where Link looks like he is in a place that is actually hot. The room after is the only room that feels like Link is running through tunnels deep underneath the cool earth. Everywhere else, the colors are completely neutral, which means I don't feel the temperature in this place. This is why color is so important. Without it, all that's left is nothing. Aside from a few rooms, I don't feel anything while playing this dungeon. There's nothing here that inspires me. Nothing here that makes my imagination run wild. Nothing that drives me to create similar settings in my own stories. The concept is so cool, but the execution is lacking. It could have been great, but in the end it just fell short. That's not to say it's bad necessarily, just that there was so much more here.